Thank you, Morgan, so much for inviting me, and Fee, and for each of you for joining us here today. Again, my name is Holly Fretwell. I am a PERC Research Fellow and an Enviropreneur. A little bit about PERC. PERC is the Property and Environment Research Center. We are a conservation organization and a research organization seeking private solutions to environmental problems. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here for a couple of slides as we move forward. To show you some pictures, and what you're seeing right here and right now is the beautiful Bozeman, Montana, where we are located. Again, PERC is the Property Environment Research Center, and we were founded back in 1980. We were founded on an idea of looking at environmental problems, and we continued to throw environmental problems towards the government to solve for us. And we were wondering why the government is not solving all these problems. Now, I was not at PERC back in 1980, but we've gone through a couple of chapters that I've been with PERC over about 25 years now. Originally, we were called the Political Economy Research Center. And the reason for that, again, is to think about what are the government solutions that are coming out, and why aren't these solutions actually solving some of the environmental issues and the environmental problems that we have, and realized it really was a political economy problem. It was a public choice problem, as you will. Why do politicians and bureaucrats act the way that they do? Why are they not more aligned with environmental conservation? And at the end of the day, when you do some research and start thinking about it, it's because incentives matter. And the incentives of our government actors and politicians are oftentimes more aligned with staying in office and gaining influence than they are with enhancing conservation. They're more interested in cutting ribbons and being noticed for new facilities, which is much more flashy than repairing and maintaining sewer systems, forests, and wildlife habitat, or maintaining infrastructure, as we're seeing with some of the issues that we're having in today's world. But then the question arises, this is more where I started with PERC, if not government, what's more effective? What are some of the types of solutions that we can have to solve some of these environmental problems? And we started to look at market solutions. And we have actually multiple examples of the private sector enhancing the environment and actually coming up with better solutions than the government outcomes that we have seen. So I have worked with PERC in some capacity for about 25 years. I have taught at Montana State University. I taught economics for about 15 years. And actually now I'm moving more into becoming an enviropreneur. So you might ask, what is an enviropreneur? An enviropreneur is an environmental entrepreneur. It is someone who does good for the environment while doing well for themselves. They're building wealth for themselves. And my story of it as an enviropreneur is in the future, but we have some really good iconic examples of where enviropreneurs have been extremely successful. And once you understand what an enviropreneur is, you can find them all over the place. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of enviropreneurs. And the first one that we're going to look at is John Hume. John Hume is a rhino rancher. And you might say, a rhino rancher? Well, maybe that's horrible. What is, the idea of actually, ranching rhinoceros and commercializing rhinoceros and keeping them on a ranch may not sound like the wildlife that you want to see, or is it in fact brilliant? Because John Hume has helped us protect the rhino and has helped keep the species on Earth and alive. Rhino numbers have declined from about 500,000 in 1900s to 27,000 today. And the majority of those rhinos live in South Africa, where John Hume is. And habitat loss is a threat to the rhino, but the biggest threat is poaching. It's killing rhinos to sell their horn. The horn is actually extremely valuable in traditional Chinese medicine, and it can bring anywhere from $3,000 to $30,000 per pound in the black market. So many of our rhinos were being poached and eliminated to use the horn for them. And John Hume, back in 1992, came up with a solution. He said, well, why not raise them? Why not ranch these rhinos? And in South Africa, you can actually own wildlife. And so he's ranching the rhinos to protect the rhino, to conserve the rhino. And he's actually paying the expenses for this rhino ranching by selling the horn. And again, you might say, well, that's a horrible thought because he actually cuts the horn off of the rhino. But a rhinoceros horn is a lot like a fingernail, in fact. You can cut it down to about 2 inches, and it does not hurt the rhino. It has no nerves, and nor do they use it for protection. And in fact, the horn can grow up to 5 inches each year. So a single horn weighs about 22 pounds. And think about what that might be worth. Single horn is worth somewhere between $60,000 and $600,000 per year and can grow over the lifetime of the rhinoceros. So what Hume has done is he's ranched these rhinos, he cuts the horn off, he sells the horn to pay for the more than $200,000 monthly cost to protect his rhinos. He has something like 1,700 white rhinos on about 20,000 acres. But there are some barriers to this. There are some problems to this. One of the barriers is that it's illegal to sell horn internationally by CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Now, domestically in South Africa, rhino horn can be traded, but from 2009 to 2017, there was actually a ban on trading rhino horn, even in South Africa. So over that 9-year period, John Hume had to figure out a different way to pay to manage his rhino ranch. And during that time period, the number of rhinoceros being poached in Africa increased dramatically. So as you can imagine, the demand is not being satisfied by people having legal trade of that rhinoceros horn. And now they're going into the illegal black market. You reduce the supply of the rhinoceros horn, that price goes up and more poachers were out there. In 2017, the domestic ban was lifted. Hume is still struggling to get above water. That was a 9-year period where he didn't have that income, but he is still trying to maintain his rhino ranch. So one of the lessons I want you to think about here from Hume is that Hume could actually own the rhinos. He owns the ranch, he owns the rhinoceros, he owns the horn of the rhinoceros, and he was able to trade them, at least in some limited ability. When he couldn't trade them, he no longer could be profitable and his business started to go under. Fortunately, again, that trade is legal again within South Africa, but he's still struggling to pay some of those back expenses that he had. So let's look at another enviropreneur. This is called Bird Returns, and it's a story about the Nature Conservancy, an NGO, in the business of conservation. And in this story, the Nature Conservancy wants to protect shorebirds, and they want to protect the shorebird habitat. And in California's Central Valley, they've lost more than 90% of some 4 million acres of wetlands that actually at one time supported about 20 to 40 million wintering waterfowl. There are only about 3 to 5 million wintering waterfowl in the region today. And this is part of the Pacific Flyway, which stretches thousands of miles from the Arctic to Patagonia. So TNC wanted to help protect these birds and to help these migrating shorebirds in this region of California, but they couldn't afford to buy all the land and they didn't want to just regulate what people could do. They came up instead with a very unique idea and they rented the land. Again, this is what they call bird returns, or sometimes it's called pop-up wetlands or occupancy agreements. And what the Nature Conservancy did is they actually pay rice farmers to protect the habitat in these regions by extending the amount of time that they keep their fields flooded, because the birds come in sometimes a little before the rice paddies are flooded and sometimes a little bit afterward. And by extending that season of keeping those lands flooded, they were able to allow for an increased habitat on this landscape. And the agricultural lands can actually meet up to about 65% of the wetland needs. All they need is about 2 to 4 inches of water left into the field for this extended period of time to actually allow for that migration pathway to take place. So they used a bunch of mapping information, new technology, GIS, GPS, and reached out to farmers to participate in this agreement. They determined exactly when and where they needed additional flooded lands to create the habitat. And then they created what's called a reverse auction. In a reverse auction, the Nature Conservancy actually reached out to landowners to submit bids for what it would cost them to provide that additional habitat. And then the Nature Conservancy chooses the lowest bid, given the proper location and timing, and actually pays those landowners to essentially rent additional habitat or rent additional water on the landscape for a couple of additional weeks to increase that habitat for the shorebirds. By the end of the first season, 10,000 acres of bird return fields had attracted more than 220,000 migrating birds from 57 species, averaging more than 100 birds per acre. Today, the TNC provides habitat for more than 1 million migrating birds. Again, a pretty cool project that they've been working on, and the ability to create this habitat and enhance this habitat at just a fraction of the cost that it would have costed to actually buy the landscape instead of renting it. And by renting, it also adds the flexibility to respond to climate and weather conditions as things are changing or as the bird's timing is changing. So it becomes this win-win outcome. The farmers are providing the continued food that we want to eat. We eat the food, and the birds still have the habitat. Again, a lesson here that we want to think about is conservation groups can partner with private landowners, and they can motivate this habitat provision if there are clear property rights. And it doesn't have to be over the birds, which is what they're trying to protect, but the habitat. They want to protect the habitat. So we have clear property rights over the habitat, and allowing for trade in the land use is what's making this negotiations cooperative agreement take place to enhance the wildlife habitat while still allowing the farmers to maintain their living. I'm going to introduce one more Enviropreneur here. This is Kim Schoeneck. Kim is an Enviropreneur. She lives in Verde, Arizona, and she wanted to stabilize the flow of the Verde River because she wanted to increase the wildlife habitat. It would drop really low during late July and early August so that fish were dying. And she's also a kayaker, and she wanted to continue her recreational opportunities into mid to late summer. And noticing that each year that river got a little bit lower during the late season. Problem was, farmers have the property right to irrigate and use this water, and they were growing really water intensive crops. They were growing corn and alfalfa. And corn and alfalfa both need quite a bit of water during those later summer months, during July and August. So that was draining the river so that the fish were in need of more water, and she wasn't able to do her kayaking down the river. If you understand water rights at all, water rights are what we call usufructuary rights. You have the right to use the water. And historically in the West, we have rights that used to be based on use it or lose it. And that is, if you didn't use your water right and you left it in stream, then you would lose that water right for the future. So nobody really wants to stop irrigating and let that water go downstream. Many states now have actually changed that water right system and have allowed for some in-stream flow and also have allowed for some water trading. So one of the things Kim could have done was actually buy the water from these farmers to encourage that water to be left downstream. But then she would have to pay those farmers year after year after year for the use of that water of that in-stream flow. So she came up with another solution, another very innovative solution. And she went to figure out, well, what other kinds of crops exist out there that we could actually sell and grow on these lands that don't take quite as much irrigation, or maybe don't irrigate during those key months when we really have low water. And she determined that barley was actually a really nice option. But seed barley doesn't provide much return or much profit for the farmers. And so they weren't willing to buy into this deal. And then she started to do a little research and realized that malting barley actually has a really competitive price with corn and alfalfa. But there's one catch here, that you have to have a malting facility nearby that's going to buy it. And there was no malting facility near Verde, Arizona. So Kim actually went out and partnered with an investor to build a malting facility, to buy the barley from the farmers, and to complete the supply chain. And then she convinced a few farmers to try the switch. And she also convinced a few local breweries to buy the local barley. So what came from Kim's innovative approach was, again, a win-win-win deal. In now that she has farmers on board that are growing barley, there's more water left in stream during those key months when water was typically low, and the rest of us all get to drink really good beer. Okay, so again, we have another lesson on clear property rights to land and water use and trade. All these were important parts of this program to ensure that Kim's project worked, was having clear property rights so that she could create this market and sort of complete that supply chain within the market. I live in Bozeman, Montana, which is in the Gallatin County, and we actually have some barley growers here that have figured that out on their own and have created their own malting facilities and have been able to reduce the water use within the stream as well. Kim just helps speed this process up. Again, she's an Enviropreneur. She created some profits and actually helped enhance the environment while doing so. So let's think a little bit about an Enviropreneur. An Enviropreneur, again, is something that's doing good for the environment while doing well for oneself. And when we think about what environmentalists rely on, or Enviropreneurs rely on, it's markets. It's that ability to generate a profit and that motivation and innovation to get out there in the marketplace and create some profit and create some good products that people are looking for at the same time. And what's really important to do that is a solid market which relies on clear property rights. And so I want to talk a little bit about what clear property rights are, we all might think, well, I own a piece of property and maybe I own a car, maybe I own a bike. But there's some really key characteristics that are super important for us to think about when we want to think about well-functioning markets and markets that can actually help us continue and create sustainable outcomes and sustainable environmental outcomes as well. Those characteristics are what I call the deal of property rights. And the first one of those characteristics is that it's definable. You know what you own. John Hume owned the land. He knew he owned that land. He also owned the rhinos. And in South Africa, you're allowed to own wildlife. In the United States, you're not allowed to own wildlife. Wildlife is owned by the public, and states manage that wildlife. So we don't have the same ability to ranch for some of the wildlife that we have to enhance their numbers. So that ownership is super important. In California, the farmers owned the land so it could be leased. Right? They actually had ownership of that land. In Arizona, farmers actually own the water rights, at least have some usufructuary rights, but those extended water rights from olden days where we had this use it or lose it system and it had to be left in stream have slowly changed and evolved to allow water markets to take place. Now, every state is a little bit different, but we actually have those increasing rights or evolving water rights, if you will, over time. And then we know what it is that we own. We also have to have defendable and excludable rights. That is, we know what we own and we can enforce that right. We can prevent other people from taking over. We can prevent other people from poaching the rhinos. We can prevent other people from using that in-stream flow when we leave it in-stream and just making that a moot point that these farmers have left that water in-stream. We want to make sure that if water is left in-stream, other irrigators downstream aren't just pulling it out and eliminating that ability that we had to try to protect that in-stream flow. So making sure that we can defend and exclude others from that property right is also really important. Property rights need to be appropriable, and that is tradable. We can sell, we can lease, we can trade our property. John sold the rhino horn to pay for the management. TNC rented the shorebird habitat. Right? Farmers sold the barley for greater profit, actually using less water. But it's that trade and those transactions that are taking place that are helping us actually make this market work and making it pay for itself, making it a long-run sustainable project rather than just a one-time trade, or as even Kim realized when she was trying to look at the water, having to pay for that water year after year after year, she'd have to come up with some way to pay for that. By changing the crop, she could actually then have that profitability each year, and those farmers would be willing to make that change in the crops because it benefited them as well. And finally, we must be liable for our property. The property that we own. John's liable if his rhinos get off of his property and trample the neighbor's cabbage patch, right? If the U.S. wildlife in our country gets out, you know what? Nobody really owns that. So nobody's really liable for that. And that's really causing some problems. Here in Montana, we have a lot of elk. They're migratory elk, and they go across ranchers' landscapes, and they eat a lot of the forage that those cattle would normally eat. In fact, one lost cutting of hay on one of the ranches nearby my house, they grow 3 cuttings each year. One lost cutting is $50,000. So when the elk eat that cutting, and they're now starting to eat 2 cuttings each year, that's $100,000 that ranch is losing each year to those wildlife. And because they're owned by the state and there's no liability, nobody has to pay the cost for that. Very differently, if we have clear property rights, we have to be liable for what we're doing. So when we think about pollution, if I'm polluting on somebody else, if property rights are clear, I'm liable for that. I'm responsible for that. And markets can help us come up with good solutions to resolve that problem. And this can be harm on an individual self or our property, right? If somebody harms me, I have a clear property right to myself and to my own safety. So again, this is a really, really important part of these key characteristics of property rights. So then I want to think a little bit about, well, what if we don't have the deal of property rights? What if we don't have these clear property rights that are defined in all these characteristics? And that happens a lot, right? And one case where that happens is the tragedy of the oceans, right? We have these ocean fisheries. We have fish populations that are plummeting, where we're collapsing these fishing populations because we're overfishing the ocean. And I want to think a little bit about why that happens and maybe how can we create some sort of property right to defend that, to prevent that from happening and to ensure that we have sustainability of our fish populations in the long run. So I want you to think about why the tragedy, and you can decide which one of these you think is correct. Is it because fishers only care about profit? We have these fishers that go out, they catch all the fish they possibly can, they're trying to bring their profit, they don't care about anything else. Is that why we have collapsing fisheries? Is it because fishers don't care about the long-term sustainability of the fishery, right? They're really interested in profits today. It's that commercial profit today that we want. We don't care about what happens in the future. Or is it maybe technology? We've got this amazing technology. We can actually find fish under the sea. We can pinpoint where they are. Is technology, has it just gotten so good that we're just catching way too many fish? It's too easy to catch fish now, perhaps. Or maybe it's because fishers don't own the fish. I mean, think about when fishers own the fish and when they don't own the fish. And the bottom line of this is we don't own the fish as a fisher until we catch it and it's dead, right? So when we own that fish is when it's dead, and when it's in the ocean, it's a commons. So we come up with a tragedy of the commons, and that is that fishers continue to go out there and catch more and more fish, because if they don't catch that fish, somebody else surely will. So they're going to catch as many fish as they possibly can. They do care about their profit margins. They do care about the long-term sustainability because that is their business, right? That is what they are doing for their livelihood. But the incentives are aligned such that if you don't catch that fish, somebody else will catch that fish. So let's look at one of the examples that really sort of has pretty simple rules, so it defines this pretty nicely. And this is the BC, British Columbia halibut fishery, and sort of looking at this historically. And between 1979 and 1991, the rules on commercial fishing were that they limited the number of vessels that could come into the commercial fishery. And they set what they call a TAC, or a total allowable catch. That's the max amount that the commercial fishermen and fishers are allowed to catch. And then when they reached that TAC, that total allowable catch, they would close the fishery and nobody else could fish anymore. So if you look back here in the 1980s, it took about 65 days to catch 5.7 million pounds of halibut, which is what they had set at the TAC in the early 1980s. So what you're looking at in this diagram is the number of days that the commercial fishers are able to get out and actually fish for halibut. That is their season length. By 1990, where we see this great drop off down here, the fishers caught 8.5 million pounds of fish in 6 days. 6 days. So you might ask, well, how could the same number of boats, there are 435 boats that were licensed here, catch more fish in 1/10 the time? And basically what it comes down to is each fisherman, to get more fish, had to be faster and better than other fishers, because we're in this race to fish. They're buying more equipment, they're buying bigger equipment, they're buying more technology. They're doing what we call overcapitalizing in the fishery. They're investing in everything they possibly can to get more and more and more fish before anybody else gets it, because they have to race to fish. If they don't catch the fish, somebody else will. If lines get tangled, if nets get tangled, they just cut them. And those fish that were caught suffer. They're not going to take the time to untangle those nets. They have 6 days to fish. The halibut fishery in Alaska actually came down to 2 48-hour periods each year. So we've restricted the number of days, and that's the type of regulatory approach we were using to try to protect these fisheries and make them more sustainable. So we came up with a different solution over time and said, well, what if instead of restricting just the number of boats, we actually restricted the amount that each commercial fishery could catch, but that amount is based on a percent. So we actually created a property right of sorts as a percent of the total allowable catch. So each fisher that was in that had a license to fish got a percent. And we can discuss later sort of how they come about, what that percent is, and who gets the right to fish. But we created what we call tradable quotas, or sometimes catch shares or rations. And these were introduced in 1991. And what you see happening is this big spike in the number of days that people can go out fishing, because now they know I have 10% of the TAC, for example. I can catch 10% of the fish. So, maybe I can catch some 400 pounds of fish or whatever it might be. And I have a longer length of time to be able to do that. They still have some timing restrictions based on when fish need to be sort of left alone, but they allow a longer length of time for these fishers to go out there and catch the fish. And it ended up that the season came out to be about 250 days long, from 6 days, and they were better able to manage that total allowable catch and ensure they weren't catching too many fish during this time period. One of the reasons for that is quota holders want to maintain and monitor each other as to how many fish are being caught, because it's not based on a certain number of pounds, it's based on a percent of the TAC. And the more fish that exist out there, the larger that TAC gets. The TAC is based on how many fish are actually out in the ocean. We measure the total number of fish in the ocean, we measure the number of fish we need in the ocean to be sustainable and have a sustainable population, and the difference between those two is that total allowable catch. So as that population grows, that TAC grows, and then each fisher gets a slightly larger number, the same percent that they previously had, but a larger number of fish that they can actually catch. So what we've seen with this is a great way to actually protect our fisheries. We've seen a lot of the fisheries that are dealt with with these tradable quotas or these rations have increased in populations, and it's provided a lot of benefits. So benefits of catch shares. For one, we've reduced the race to fish. The season length has increased. Fishermen now have the ability to go out when they want to go out and do the fishing. So as a result, we've reduced the risk. If you've ever watched The Perfect Storm or some of these TV shows on these fishers or crabbers that are going out in these horrible conditions, they don't have to do that anymore. If they have the longer length of time, they don't have to get out there in the 6 days and make sure they're catching as much as they can in those 6 days. They can actually take their time, get out there when it makes more sense, when it's safer, and bring those fish back in over that longer length of time. As a result of that, consumers also get fresh fish more often. Whereas we used to get that halibut for 6 days, fresh halibut for 6 days, the rest of it's frozen. Now we have fresh fish more often. We're not wasting as much fish because all that fish isn't coming in as a one big glut into the marketplace at one time and be processed at one time. A lot of fish was wasted because our processing facilities couldn't take in that much fish at one point in time. So we get more fresh fish over a longer period of time and less is wasted. And as a result of that, that fish value increases, right? It's more valuable. We appreciate the fish more. We're willing to pay a little bit more for that fresh fish. It tastes a heck of a lot better. And fishermen also get a better price for that fish. And that overcapitalization is reduced. We no longer have to invest to be better than every single other fisherman. We know what we can catch. We get out there. We are more efficient in what we're actually investing, the boats that we're buying, the lines that we're buying, the gear that we're buying, and we're more willing to try to protect that gear and save that gear if it gets tangled, which also saves the fish that are caught in that gear at that point in time. And finally, our fishers are motivated to manage for a sustainable fishery. As I was saying, it is in their best interest to increase that total population of fish because that also increases the number of fish or the pounds of fish that they can catch based on their percent of the TAC. So I want to look at a little bit what I call the market spectrum. So we say we need some pretty clear property rights, and if we have those really clear, well-defined property rights, markets work pretty well for us. And at one end of the market spectrum, we have what we call free market environmentalism. And those are the Enviropreneurs I was talking about. Those are the John Humes, the TNC, at least in that example, and Kim Shonocks of the world. These are the people that are actually going out there, they're doing something, working within the marketplace to both enhance conservation, enhance the environment, and they're making a profit doing so. But we don't always have those clear property rights. So what happens when we don't have those clear property rights? We have what we call these market-based solutions, right? These are essentially government-defined rights, and that's exactly what we see when we look at the catch shares, right? We have this commons, this tragedy of the commons that are existing in our ocean fisheries, and fish swim. So how are you going to create some property right on some creature that swims and that moves around, and who owns the rights even to the ocean? So one of the keys for the catch shares is that each country actually owns 200 miles out from their shoreline and what we call our easy rights, and we actually have management in that country of that 200-mile distance. Beyond that, it's open waters. Beyond that, it's international waters. It's much harder to create treaties and rules and regulations beyond that. But within those 200 miles, each different country has done some different types of experiments with how are we going to protect those fisheries, what sort of regulations do we need. Many countries have come up with these catch shares and tradable quotas, and that has been very successful in most areas. Certainly not perfect. One of the deals that is here, we look at these market-based solutions, is it's really a cap and trade solution. right? The catch share is a cap and trade, and government is coming in and saying, okay, here's the cap. Here's the TAC. This is the total allowable catch. This is all you can have. That's our cap. And within that, then we have to figure out how we're going to allocate those rights, those use rights within it. Who gets that? Who gets the TAC? Who gets what percent? How do we define what that is? And then we are allowed to trade those. And the whole point of trading it is so that we can continue to encourage people to be more innovative and make sure that we're getting the lowest cost producers out there actually producing the fish and actually going out there fishing. If I'm a really a bad fisher and I get out there and I can't catch very many fish and it's costing me an immense amount of money to catch my share, I might have somebody else that's a fisher or maybe that hasn't been fishing that wants to come buy my share because they're better at it and they can make more money at it and they're willing to pay me to sort of take that over and create more profits from it. So that trade, that tradable part of the quota is super important to make sure we're coming at the most efficient, lowest cost answer to this. And we can think about other types of cap and trade with sulfur dioxide and other pollutants as well. And those are, again, what we call market-based. And that is the government sets that cap and then allows for those trades to take place. These can be extremely efficient and extremely well run. One problem is when government gives something away, they can also take it away. And we look at the sulfur dioxide trades. We had a great trading scheme that took place for a number of years. And then in 2012, they changed what that equation looked like and they sort of fell apart. So we need to be very careful about that. But market-based would be a way to try to create some of those markets where we don't actually have markets and we don't have clear property rights. And then I'm going to skip all the way to the other end of the spectrum and look at political environmentalism. Well, what is political environmentalism and why don't we just want to have government solve all our problems? Again, that's where PERC started. And the reason that political environmentalism doesn't work well is because the incentives aren't right. And what we tend to see is that government solutions are a winner-takes-all solution. They're not this cooperative solution. They're not this, the farmer gets to continue to farm the rice and the Nature Conservancy pays the farmer and for the habitat, and now we have both habitat and rice. They tend to be one or the other solutions, not a cooperative solution. So we're going to take a really quick look at the Klamath Basin in southern and central Oregon. And the Klamath Basin has many times over the years suffered from drought conditions. And there are competing claims for the water in the Klamath Basin. And probably the main competing claims, or at least the ones I'm going to talk about right now, are irrigation or that in-stream flow. And what you're looking at here is a farmer hoping to irrigate his landscape or her landscape. And then this really low flow that actually did occur and had a major fish kill. But if we have these competing claims, we have to have some sort of allocation system to distribute the water. And again, if we go back to our historic water rights, the farmers had the rights. The farmers had senior rights based on that prior appropriation doctrine, which is what covers most of our Western water law. And that right is set based on a first in time, first in right. So the first person that came to the waterway way back in history and started claiming and actually using some of that water got a right to that amount of water. The second person that came could use water, more water. They couldn't impact the amount of water that first person was using, but they could continue to claim water and use how much water they wanted. And then they would also have a right to the water. And so if the first person was there in 1800, and let's say the 10th person is coming in 1850 and they're trying to claim water, they can only claim the amount of water that's left in that river without impacting the others. So the first individual there has what we call senior rights. And if it's a low water year, the first person that was there with those senior rights is the one that gets their full allocation before anybody else down that waterway gets their right. And so what happened here on the Klamath is we had these farmers that have these senior rights. And then we also have these endangered species. And we have salmon and suckerfish in the Klamath that are both endangered species. And in 2001, there was a major drought, and the government was very concerned about these endangered species. And so they decided that they were going to have this political environmental solution, and they were going to make sure that that water stayed in stream to protect those species. And they chose fish over farmers, and they cut the water off to the farmers. That was a loss of $157 million in crops to those farmers in that year, in 2001. And the banks refused to give these farmers additional loans because they were suddenly concerned about the fact that maybe they wouldn't get their water back, so that maybe they wouldn't be able to pay this loan back again. So there was this huge conflict that took place and a huge uproar, and the drought continued. And in 2002, government actors decided, well, that didn't work well for us, so we're going to choose farmers instead of the endangered species, and instead of it leaving the in-stream flow. And then that's the picture you're looking at here. That low water flow, actually the water got so warm because it was so low that there was a bacterial fish kill. And so as a result, one year they chose the fish, farmer lost. The next year they chose the farmer, fish totally lost. This is what we call political environmentalism. It's a winner takes all solution. It creates this great animosity and conflict over the use. And we can compare that to the market approach that encourages cooperation through markets, trade, and negotiation. And in the Klamath in 2004, they actually started to have some negotiations, realizing that property rights are really important, and we have these senior rights holders, and they started to negotiate. They started to have cooperative solutions to allow some irrigation and some in-stream flow. And farmers can actually be paid to use less water, right? We can actually negotiate for this to make sure that we both are protecting the farmer and where the farmer is able to still generate their revenues, and that we're able to protect that in-stream flow. So again, the lesson here and the note that we want to pay attention to is that clear ownership rights enable that market trade to take place and allow negotiations to function. And it's really based on what we as citizens in society want, because we're the ones creating those values through our price systems, rather than politicians and bureaucrats deciding what the best answer should be. So I'm going to sum up here and just say that when you see environmental problems, start looking at the property rights, start looking at that deal of property rights. Are they clear? Do we have those characteristics? And if they are, markets and trade can help us get most of the time to efficient outcomes. And again, to efficient outcomes as they're desired by society, because they're based on prices that we as individuals are feeding into that price system. And so we're getting those signals from those prices as to what we desire. If they're not clear, what is the allocation system that exists there? Is it a political environmentalism? Is it something else? And what can be done to clarify the rights, to lower the transaction cost of trade and actually limit that political environmentalism, so we can come up with more cooperative solutions and less conflict and conflicting solutions. I will stop there. Thank you again for allowing me to present these ideas. I hope that you have some questions to go along with this, and please do also take a look at our PERC website. We are at perc.org, at PERC tweets, and at PERC_conserve. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll see if we can take some questions from you all. So I have one question here. Is it true that corporations, bring this over here, have the largest negative impact on the environment? How can we hold corporations accountable without government intervention? And I don't know how we calculate whether corporations have a bigger impact on the environment than government has on the environment. If we look here in the United States, government actually owns 50% of our lands. 50% of our lands are public lands. And if you look at how those lands are managed, it's actually one of the areas of research that I've spent a lot of time in. They are not well conserved. They are not well protected because the incentives are really not aligned there. And we see a lot of our, think about wildfire in the West right now. The reason that we're having such extensive wildfires in the West is because our agencies have not done a good job managing our forest over time. And we see that we have extremely dense landscapes, dense forests, and lots of fuels build up in there that historically would have been burned naturally. But because we have not allowed those fires to take place, because we have more drought conditions now, because we have hotter summers now, we're seeing greater impacts. And I would say that is a horrible impact on the environment. So I don't necessarily agree that corporations have the largest negative impact, but I do think that one of the really important keys for us to consider here is that the liability for our property rights. And if we have clear property rights, then people are liable for the harm done. And the common law actually does a really good job historically in protecting in protecting the environment. And there's lots of case studies that go back into the early 1800s or mid 1800s and early 1900s that actually have sided with environmental concern. You have an industry or a corporation, a paper plant is one that's coming to mind right now, that's actually polluting the waterway, and it's a farmer downstream that's being impacted, took it to court, and the farmer won the deal because we have this right to have to not be polluted on, and so common law can take care of that. The Environmental Protection Agency, which was created in 1976, actually changed that, and now the Environmental Protection Agency gets to decide how much is too much pollution. And if somebody is abiding by the EPA and some of their solutions, then even if harm is done downstream, that downstream person that is impacted no longer has recourse against the industry and the corporation itself. So I think we need to think very carefully about what is it that we want from government? What is government actually doing to help us? And what are some of the other solutions? And I would say, again, common law is not perfect either, but we want to think very carefully about what some of those solutions might be. That was probably a long-winded answer for you there, but hopefully it got at some of that. What impact do things like plastic bag tax or fee have on plastic usage? I have not studied plastic bags and taxes on plastic bags and fees for their use, etc. So I don't know what the outcome of that is. I do know that where we have most of our plastic pollution problems is not in the United States and not in the developed world. It's in the developing countries, and that's where we really need to start thinking about some of the solutions that they might have. So I'm sorry I don't have a great answer for you on that one. Oops, I just lost. Is there any amount of merging that needs to occur between politics, the establishment of property rights, or can they remain relatively separate? Another great question here. We don't have clear property rights unless we have some form of governance. So we need to have a strong government to protect our property rights, and that is probably one of the most important roles of governance. And if we have governance, obviously the politics is going to play a role in there. So yes, there is a very strong connection between those two. But if we can actually sort of limit the amount of governance that we have to protecting those property rights and allow some of those negotiations to take place in the marketplace, we're going to come up with some better solutions, whether it's for environmental concerns or anything else. That said, markets aren't perfect, right? We don't always have clear property rights. What about the air? How do we create good property rights on the air? It's hard to, I can't just create a little property right around my little box around my head to prevent other people from impacting my air. So there are areas where we certainly need some form of governance to help us resolve some of these issues, or to create maybe those market-based solutions, right, to help us better create those property rights. And I think that is super important, super interesting, but also super important for us to keep in mind. Is for those of you that have studied some economics, externalities exist. There are impacts that each of us do that have an impact on somebody else, but maybe didn't want that impact and didn't choose that impact, but it was put upon them anyway. And how do we help resolve some of those problems? Some of those are fairly simple for us to resolve, and just through negotiation, through personal negotiation. If your neighbor is smoking at the fence line and you don't like it, you can have a conversation with them. Some of them are much more difficult. That particular example, we have two people standing next to each other. What about when we have an industry in one area that's polluting, and that pollution is going long way downwind and is impacting millions and millions of homes? And what if it's not just one industry? What if it's a whole bunch of different businesses and corporations? What if it's farmers and it's all the farmers in the region that are each of them putting a little bit of pollution into the waterway? That makes the cost much more difficult to actually allow for these negotiations to take place. So we really need to think carefully about how to do that. And again, that's why I come back to this idea of, do we have clear property rights? And if we don't have clear property rights, what can we do to better define those rights so that we can come up with these solutions? And sometimes it becomes, instead of having one individual negotiate with another, maybe it's a group or a club, maybe it's a homeowners association that's working together to try to coordinate a solution with some other group or industry or something of that sort. So again, I think that there is a very important connection between politics or governance and property rights and property ownership, and we want to make sure that we continue to protect our property. I think that's really important. Another one here, thanks to Branson and Bezos, more people are going into space. Earth orbit is filling up with debris from previous flights. Is it possible there's a property rights scheme to handle this apparent tragedy of the commons? Yeah, good question. And I mean, we can look at our oceans in a very similar way and say, wow, what are we doing in those common waters, in those international waters? And it's extremely difficult to create treaties amongst a whole bunch of different countries. I mean, we look at the whaling and how we have a number of countries that are still out there whaling, even though that we know that there's some species out there, that there's just not a lot left, right? We have some endangered species. We want to restrict those whales that are being killed, but we don't have a whole lot of power in those international waters. I would suggest that as we're filling up our space as well, it's going to be really difficult to create some property rights out there, but it's going to be super important to do so. One of the things we do have going for us is that we have new technologies. We're able to track some of these things down, and as new technologies are coming forth, it's lowering the cost to do some of these things. So again, bringing it down to the ocean fisheries or to the whales, we can actually track whales, right? We can actually track where those whales are. We can see where they are. We can share that, and maybe at some point in time, we'll actually be able to create some property rights over that. And again, maybe the same thing with thinking about our flights and our space and putting too much junk into space. We'll be able to track what that is and who put it up there, and create a property right in the sense of a liability. You are liable for anything that you have left up in space. Again, the difficult part there is that it's a international space, and it's really hard to enforce those treaties. And I don't have good solutions for that. But as we find, as problems become worse, we tend to resolve them more readily. If you look back in the Western United States when we were homesteading, for example, originally there weren't very many people out here, and so people just sort of moved in. They took over the landscape. They managed those lands. You know, they put their cattle on the ranch. They might be nomadic sheep herders, and they went across the ranch. And we really didn't try to address the property rights problem there until there became conflict. So when we have some conflict, we are more than likely to come up with some better solutions and to get some more agreement at the international level. But it is a international tragedy of the commons, and those are extremely, extremely difficult to create negotiations and cooperative solutions for. Aren't domestic environmental issues tied intrinsically to international environmental issues? What can we do about this? And potentially, they can be, they don't have to be. If we think about our environmental issues, if somebody is smoking next to me, that's really a very low cost, small scale problem that we might be having. And I would call that a pollution problem. And I can address that by talking to somebody that's probably not going to have an international impact. But for sure, we want to see if there's an international impact. If we in the United States decide that we're going to regulate and we're going to make it more expensive to harvest trees, or we're going to put some major emissions reductions on people, make it extremely costly here for industry to continue to produce, they're going to go overseas, right? And we're going to push them overseas. And then we definitely have this intrinsic relationship between the domestic issues and the international issues. So we want to be super careful when we're creating regulations or whatever it is that we're doing to try to resolve some of these environmental problems, that we're not just pushing it over onto somebody else overseas. And one of the things that we can do about it, again, locally here within the United States, is pay attention to what those, what incentives we're providing to our producers? Are we motivating them to do a better job here? Or are we just motivating them to move overseas where the regulations are likely not as heavy-handed? And we want to be very, very careful about that. And I think that's super important. And again, one of the things we think about when we're looking at markets and property rights and resolving these issues is trying to resolve these issues right here through cooperative approaches, make it a win-win deal. What is that waste product that's coming out? Can we use that waste product? And if you go back in history, you have all sorts of enviropreneurs and innovators and entrepreneurs that have taken waste product and found a good use for it. We can think of just some of the recycling that we have with cans. We've been able to figure out how to use cans and recycle those fairly readily. That is probably the poster child of recycling. We have all sorts of other waste products that exist out there that we're not very good at actually repurposing them, and that might cost us more to repurpose than actually just throwing them in the trash. But that's an opportunity, right? We can think of enviropreneurs as looking for opportunities to create new marketplaces. And if we have clear property rights, they're able to do that. If they don't have clear property rights, then it's much more difficult for them to do that. One more question here. What does it mean to be carbon neutral? Is that a good thing? And I think this is a trick question. Carbon neutral, I guess it depends who you're asking, but carbon neutral in my mind is saying that I'm, however much carbon I am putting out, I have some way to offset that. And therefore, I'm actually not emitting carbon in the atmosphere because I'm putting some out and I'm taking some back in. And if we thought about a tree, for example, you might be able to think about a tree being, I don't know if they actually are carbon neutral, but just the sense that trees actually sequester carbon, they pull that carbon in, and then when they decay, they send that carbon out. And if they were pulling in exactly the same amount of carbon that they put out, then they would be carbon neutral. And over time, forests are carbon neutral because it's just a back and forth. So is that a good thing? Depends upon what I'm using to offset my emissions with. If I'm saying I'm going to offset my emissions by planting more trees, and then I'm never going to let those trees be cut again, that may not be a good thing in the long run because we're not considering all the different nuances that are occurring there. One of the things that are often used as an offset is, well, we have this forest that exists here and we're just going to set that forest aside and we're going to say it's got carbon credits because forests actually sequester carbon, they suck that carbon in and they hold it within the wood and within the leaves and within the tree itself, and therefore we have carbon there, so we're going to say no more cutting of this forest. But what we do know with regards to carbon sequestration in forest is that forests sequester more carbon as they're small and growing, and eventually they get big, and then they hold that carbon in, but they don't sequester additional carbon. And then when they actually burn or decay, they emit that carbon out again. We can actually look at the carbon cycle for forests, which is if we take that tree once it gets big and it's holding that carbon in, we can cut that tree, we can make wood products out of that tree, tables and chairs, homes, etc. And the carbon is retained within that wood until that wood is actually decayed or burned at some endpoint in its life cycle. And then we can plant more trees and we can sequester more carbon in those new trees. So is carbon neutral a good thing if we have carbon credits that are, making sure that we don't cut any trees? Probably not, because we're actually probably going to emit more carbon because we're going to be forced to be using more fossil fuel building products rather than using wood. So it's a really tricky question, and it really depends on what you are using to offset your carbon emissions. So it looks like we don't have any additional questions there. Any last minute questions that somebody has? Again, if you come up with additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I am at Holly, HOLLY, at PERC, PERC.org. Happy to continue the conversation. We have a brand new PERC reports, which is our biannual report that we share. Take a look, check it out. It's got some great articles on it. One of the first articles is actually on climate change and adaptation. So I think you might be, I found it super interesting. You might find it interesting as well. I see one more question here. What are certified B corporations? I don't know a lot about B corporations. It's a little bit out of my field, but one of the things that we have been talking about when we're thinking about conservation in one of the sort of ranch areas that has a lot of wildlife costs. The elk are migrating, as I said earlier, across these ranches, and they're coming at great cost to some of these ranch lands. One of the things that we might think about is creating a corporation and incorporating various different components of various different owners within this to work together to create that type of a corporation. And the B Corporation has come up a lot in that conversation, but again, I can't tell you the specifics because honestly, I don't know the specifics of a B Corporation. Sorry, I can't help you more there.
All right. Any final questions from the participants? We may have enough time to answer one more question. We have 3 minutes. If somebody has a very simple 3-minute question.
So if we don't have any questions, I will tell you all what's in the middle of that, my market spectrum. We started with free market environmentalism, we went to market-based, and then I showed you the political environmentalism at the other end. The one picture that I have, and there's of course, this huge spectrum that you can add all sorts of stuff, but the one other piece in there that I sometimes add in there is taxes and subsidies. Do we want to have taxes and subsidies? So as you're thinking about what are some of the solutions, do we want, for those of you that study economics, we want Pagoovian taxes, and think carefully about who gets to decide what that tax is and where that tax is spent. I would say that fits very much in the political environmentalism picture, but again, it's one that should be discussed on its own because it's got a lot of different nuances. I stick with the free market environmentalism and the market-based ideas. I think those are really our more sustainable solutions, and I think what we really need to do is come up with more sustainable solutions, and making things economically viable for the long run is what's going to help us get that sustainability. The political answers that we're getting tend to change with different administrations, have lots of different influence from different groups and people, and they oftentimes rely on government funding that is simply not sustainable over time. And again, look at our public lands and the battles that we constantly have to try to maintain our park infrastructure, just to try to maintain our forests so they're not burning up and causing havoc across the country, right, with the smoke that's being caused by that. How can we create maybe some more public-private partnerships to help resolve some of those problems, because those are on public lands. So we obviously have to have a public answer to go with that, but we have a lot of private institutions and industries that are interested in some of the products that might be produced from that, not just forest products, but water, clean air, recreation opportunity, wildlife habitat and diversity.